Hi, this is John. I'd like to continue our series on farming for profit. And you remember in our last episode, we looked at how once we've defined our profit as a dollar value, we can from that work out the three major components that build up to make our profit. Firstly, our income. Secondly, our variable costs. And thirdly, our overhead costs. With those three defined, we can then formulate our whole production strategy for our farm. Now, when we look at those three components, we obviously have to budget them now. We have to drill down and figure out how exactly are we going to build up our whole farm model that it is a usable plan for our future. And this plan, once we've defined the profit, starts with defining our income. So we're going to look at our income. Without an income, we are going nowhere. If we do not have an income, we only have costs. And if we only have costs, we're in trouble. So we need to have an income, and that's where we need to start. And we need to be quite bold and dream big when it comes to our farm. Even if we have a small farm, we should dream big and think, what is the potential of our farm? What income could we earn? There are three components that build up our income. The first is the number of units. The number of units. That could be the number of hectares that we've got, the number of animals that we've got. So that's the number of units. The second is the yield or the production per unit. Okay, so obviously we're going to achieve a certain production from each unit, whether that's a certain weight gain on an animal or a certain amount of grain from a crop or a certain size of vegetable. And then we're going to have the price of product. So those three things determine our income. And we have to figure that out. The easiest is the number of units. We know how many hectares we've got or how many animals we can keep. So let's just say we've got 10 hectares. And we can estimate or be bold in deciding how much can we get from each hectare. And let's just be talking about maize for the moment. And we say we can get 5 tons a hectare. And then we think about the price. And let us be bold and think that we can get $300 a ton for our maize. So now we can multiply these three out and get our total income. So 10 times 5 is 50, and 50 times 300 is $15,000. So that's the potential income that we can get from this enterprise that is on our farm. So now we've got that parameter set, and that gives us a goal to work towards. Something that we can say, yeah, that's what we want to achieve on those 10 hectares this season. Having determined our income, we can now look at the two cost centers of our farm. The one is the variable cost. Now remember, variable costs are those costs that vary with the scale of our enterprise or with the output of our enterprise. So if we have 1 hectare or 10 hectares, those costs are going to be related to those numbers of hectares. Likewise, if we have 1 animal or 10 animals or 100 animals, our costs are going to be related to that number of animals. So these are variable costs. They're different from overhead costs, which we will look at just now. Our variable costs depend on the enterprise that we have. When we look at a livestock enterprise, the main costs that we have there are feed and water, it's provision of water. Okay, but feed could be the biggest cost. Then we look at the health costs of our animals, the veterinaries, medicines, keeping our animals in a good environment, with the warmth that they require if they're broilers or pigs, the stabling of the animals, the housing of the animals if they're like dairy cattle, the cost involved in that, and labor. Now there may be other costs as well related to these, but those are probably the three main ones: the feed, the veterinary and medicines, the health costs, and the labor. When it comes to crops, generally there are many more costs related to growing a crop, but these could be defined in these sort of general categories. The field operations. Okay, these might be your tractor operations for land preparation, sowing, spraying, and so on. Then the seed, you're going to need seed for your crop. You're going to have some kind of nutrition that you provide to your crop, so fertilizers or organic manures or whatever. There's going to be cost there. And then your weed, pest, disease control. So there's a cost that you might have to incur, whether it's use of herbicides, insecticides, or pesticides, or some organic approach to the control of these things, and labor for doing all these operations. Now there may be other costs, and we can think of things like marketing costs. So both of these will have a marketing cost related to them, transport cost to bring fertilizers to the farm or to take the product from the farm to the market. There may be other things that we might have to spend, but these are generally the main kind of costs that you're going to be considering. And now we can turn our attention to the overhead costs. Now remember, we spoke about these costs as being fixed. They don't generally change with the size of our operation. Of course, there may be some scale factors involved. So if you go from a small to a very big operation, your overhead costs will increase. But for any one farm, generally these overhead costs remain constant, whether you grow 1 hectare or 10 hectares, or you yield 1 ton or 10 tons, or you produce 100 birds or 500 birds. These costs will generally be constant. We also spoke about these as being wealth generating expenses. In other words, they're expenses that should help you to run your farm in such a way that you create wealth. If you have expenses on your farm which are not contributing to your farm operation and your farm wealth creation, then they are costs to be questioned and maybe even eliminated. So the costs here are things like salaries. You have to pay yourself something, and you might be using your skills and expertise on all your farming operations and not just on one thing. So you have to give yourself a fair wage. We have to think of things like rent. If you are renting your land, sometimes we have licenses to pay to the local council or whatever. You need to cover those costs. You might have things like electricity and vehicles. the vehicles that you run, which are not specific for any one enterprise. So these are the kinds of costs that are overheads. And like I said in one of the previous episodes, if any one of these costs is not contributing to the wealth of your farm, why are you spending money on them? So these are your overhead costs, which we need to budget for. And so once we've got those budgets created of our income, our variable costs, and then our overheads, we can then see, do these combine, when we put them all together, do they give us the profit that we intend to have? And this is an iterative process. It's a process of adjusting the numbers and looking at possibilities and looking at ways of doing things on your farm in such a way that you achieve, or at least on paper, the profit that you want to get. I remember one person once said, the easiest profit to make is profit on a paper with a pencil. But it is necessary to do this exercise, because otherwise, how do you define your activities on the farm? How do you decide whether to spend this money or not? How do you have a goal for your yield and your income? So it is important to drill down and really work out these budgets for your farm. Now I have got spreadsheet budgets. These are templates that you can use for things like broilers, layers, pigs, cattle, crops. So all these budgets are on a template form on an Excel spreadsheet, and you're welcome to get these. If you just ask me, I'll send them to you by email. Now, the next thing I want us to think about is, how do you really now analyze this budget that you've created for your farm, this financial plan for your farm? What are some of the key things you need to start asking yourself so that you can really analyze and say, is this a robust plan? Is it the best plan? Is it going to really work for us on our farm? So let's look at these ways we can interrogate our budget and farm plan. So now we want to put our budget or our farm plan to the test. One of the first things we can look at is what we call the break-even analysis. And there are two ways to look at this. We can look at the break-even yield and the break-even price. So the break-even yield. This is the yield that we must obtain to cover the costs that we've incurred. So in a simple form, this break-even yield equals our variable costs, our variable cost per hectare divided by the price that we will get in dollars per ton. So let us assume that we have variable cost of $1,000 per hectare, and our budgeted price from our income model is, let's say, $250 per ton. $250 per ton is what we have assumed we are going to achieve. Therefore, our break-even yield is 4 tons per hectare. So that 4 ton a hectare is what we must achieve in order to break even. If we are getting less than 4 ton a hectare, we are making a loss in that enterprise. If we get more than 4 ton a hectare, we are going to make a positive gross margin. We are not yet making a profit because we have to cover our overhead expenses. But at least on that enterprise, we are going to have a positive gross margin if our yield is greater than 4 ton a hectare in this case. The second break-even analysis is the break-even price, and this we calculate as the variable cost divided by the yield that we expect to achieve. Now remember, in our income model we specified the yield that we want to achieve. Now again, if our variable costs are $1,000 per hectare and the yield that we set in our model is 5 ton per hectare, we need to achieve a price of at least $200 per ton in order to break even. So if we do get 5 ton a hectare and our price is more than $200 a ton, we are going to make a positive gross margin in that enterprise. So this gives us some parameters to work with. We must aim at a yield of at least 4 ton a hectare, and we must aim at a price of at least 200 if we're going to really make this enterprise work for us. Now this doesn't take into account overhead expenses. If you only had one enterprise on the farm, you can add your overheads into this equation. But if you've got multiple enterprises on the farm, it's a little bit difficult to allocate those overheads to the different enterprises. And so it's usually better then to just work out your break-even analysis on each enterprise. Or in some cases, you can allocate your overheads on some weighted average manner, like on the number of units or the area that each enterprise occupies or whatever. If you've got livestock and cropping, it's a little bit difficult to say how much should go to the livestock of your overheads and how much of your overheads should go to your cropping. So this is the one way to analyze your enterprise gross margin budget, is to look at the break-even yield and the break-even price. Now a second way of analyzing your farm plan budget is to look at the riskiest assumption. Okay, so when you build up your model, you make certain assumptions about the components that make up that model. You make an assumption about the yield, the price, the production that you expect to get through the season. You know, is it going to be a good season, a bad season? What are the different components that make up this enterprise? So here you look at all the assumptions such as yield, season, market, input costs, resource availability, labor, productivity, and so on. You can think through all the assumptions that you made and then analyze them and say, okay, which one is the most riskiest here? If I had a problem with one of these, which one is it going to be? Which one is now the one that can pose the greatest or have the greatest effect on my success? And you might decide, okay, it's the season, the weather, the rainfall. Okay, because especially this year, 2023, there's been talk of El Nino affecting our season, and El Nino usually brings about some drier weather conditions. So we made an assumption of yield. Now, if we now look at this assumption of the weather, that's assuming that the weather will be a certain pattern. Now, if that one is what we think is the most riskiest, then we can adjust our management to try and mitigate that risk. We might think it's the market. We're not sure about the markets here. So even before we begin, we can start thinking, making plans, strategies to assure ourselves that we will have a secure market for our product. Or resource availability. 2 years ago, was it, when the Ukraine-Russia war began, there was all of a sudden this risk that there wouldn't be enough fertilizer, or the fertilizer price would escalate greatly. So how do we manage that on the farm? Do we look at different fertilizer sources? Do we think about reducing our fertilizer in order to mitigate this risk that might occur? So these are the things that we can do now in our second analysis of our farm plan, is look at those assumptions and figure out which are serious, which are likely to occur, and if they do occur, how much impact will they have on my farm, and then what strategies do I implement to mitigate that or those risks. The third thing that we can look at is, what is the weakest link in our production plan? Now, if you think about a cropping plan, you begin with land. You then might prepare that land, fertilize it, plant, grow, harvest. Okay, so these are the sequences that occur through that production. For livestock, it might be, for example, if it's broilers, it could be chicks, day-old chicks, brood them for 1-2 weeks to get them up into a stage where they can live without lighting and heat and so on. The growth phase, and then the market. Okay, so these are the sequences that our enterprises will occur in. Now, for each of these, we can think, well, what are the inputs, what are the factors that affect these things? So like for growing, we need rain, we need sun, weeds might be a problem, pests, okay, that can all affect things there. Planting, the operation itself, okay, the machining or the actual operating process of planting that seed, the variety, okay, the fertilizer is our fertility in the soil, the pH, it might be the availability of fertilizer, the land preparation, we need diesel. If we're using tractors, we need machines, and then on the land it could be things like erosion, runoff. Okay, so we look at all these things that can impact the process that we are going through. For our chickens, it could be things like electricity to run the lights. It could be feed here, water. It could be labor that we need to feed these. It could be theft. It could be here availability. Okay, so there are all these things that when we link them together, when we put them all together, we eventually get to the market. And now we can analyze and say, all right, on my farm, in my enterprise, what is the weakest link at this particular point? Okay, so at the beginning, on my lands, when I look at my land, what is the factor that's going to affect this crop the most. And then I must work to deal with that weakest link at that point. I must find ways to deal with that. And have I budgeted for that in my operation? Perhaps it's the variety. Maybe you don't have the best variety, or you don't know what the best variety is, and you need to investigate. It could be a weak link. You might choose the wrong variety, and that could upset your whole yield target and income. What weeds and pests are you expecting? And have you budgeted and have you put in a plan to deal with that? So this is the weakest link approach, that you analyze your operations, the sequence of operations, and which one is the weakest link, and then deal with that as best you can. And then, even while you are doing that, looking at where are there problems that are going to disrupt your achievement of each operation. So that's the third way of analyzing your budget and farm plan, is looking at the weakest links and dealing with those in each enterprise. Now, the fourth way of analyzing your farm plan, your budget, is to look at cost saving. When we sit down at our desk and we start working out our farm plan, and we begin to look at the riskiest assumptions and our weakest links, we might find that, and when we do that break-even analysis, we might find that our costs are too high. We've been a little bit ambitious in our costs, and we've got to now try and trim those costs. So one of the first things you can do is, what is the highest cost item? And tackle that one. Often we think of cost savings, we won't buy tea bags, or we won't spend money on mahewu for the workers, or something like that, okay? But my proposal is that you look at the most expensive items in each budget and say, can I do without it? Is there a way around this big cost? So in crop production, usually the biggest cost is fertilizer. So how can you reduce your fertilizer costs? Are there ways that you can manage your fertility in such a way that you provide a balanced fertilizer regime for your crops without an over application of fertilizer? Now, with fertilizer, if you plot yield against fertilizer rate, okay, so the more fertilizer you put on, you don't get a linear relationship. You get a relationship like this. You get diminishing returns. Now, very often, we tend to think of applying fertilizer at the maximum rate to get the maximum yield. But that costs a lot of money. So what would happen if we cut our fertilizer in half? What would happen? You're not going to halve your yield in most cases. You might reduce your yield somewhat, and it might not impact your overall operation that much. And in fact, you might even make more profit at the end of the day. So look carefully at your costs. Begin with the most expensive ones and look at, can I eliminate it? Yes, no. If I do eliminate it, what effect will it have on my output? Or can I reduce it and become more efficient, more economical in those costs? The second thing is to say, where do I get maximum return for each dollar spent. Okay, so you have a limited budget, okay? No one has got, well, maybe not no one, but very few farmers have got a lot of money to spend on their farming operation. And in any case, you want to make a positive gross margin and a profit at the end of the day. So if I've got a certain amount of money, where do I put that money to get the best return? Is it fertilizer or is it irrigation? Is it weed control in the early stages of my maize crop development? Is it improving the way I feed my animals so that it's more efficient and less loss? Where can I spend money to get the best return? So analyze your cost and say, is that cost really earning me income? Is it really contributing to that output of yield that I expect? And you can apply that also to your overheads. Is the money that I'm spending on each overhead item really contributing to the wealth creation on my farm? Someone once said this: first do that which is free. Okay, so look at your enterprise and look at doing things that don't cost you a dollar amount. For example, we have grazing. Can we not utilize our grazing instead of feeding our animals? Okay, that's just a question. I'm not saying that that's the way to go, but what is there for our crops that is free? Animal manure. Integrating our animals with our crop production so that we can improve the fertility of our soil. It doesn't cost us anything. And so if we do that, we are improving our potential of yield. Secondly, do that which is cheap. Do that which is cheap. So again, this is sort of related to this point of where will you get the maximum return. Spend money where it's not going to cost you a lot, but you expect to get a good return. Look for good buys. There was a thing going around on one of the WhatsApp groups I looked at the other day. Guys were comparing the price of one product across different suppliers. And the costs ranged almost double, triple from one supplier to another. And so look for bargains. Look for cheaper products. Of course they must be good, because sometimes, when you buy cheap you get rubbish, but there are always opportunities to find things cheaper which are still have the quality that you require. And then lastly, it says lastly, if cash allows, spend on expensive. Spend on expensive items if cash allows. So these are ways to look at your costs, find ways to save on your money, save on your costs, because profit, remember the equation, it's income minus costs. You can save on your costs and maintain your income, your profit is going to be bigger. Finally, in this episode, I want us to think of what must I do to make this plan a success. You've spent a lot of time, thinking about your vision for your farm, creating a profit goal, and then drilling down into the income, variable costs, and overheads. You've analyzed how you can save costs, how you can improve efficiencies, and so on. But now what must you do? What must you do to really make this plan a success? Do you need to improve timeliness? Some people have said, and I believe them, I think it's true, farming is all about timeliness, getting things done on time. Do you need to be more timely in the way you are farming? How about being less wasteful? Every time you move a tractor, every time you move a bag, every time you get in your car to go somewhere, you are spending money. And if it's not for a good purpose, it's a waste. If people are standing around doing nothing, they're wasting time. If they're having to walk a long distance to go and get something to bring it back, they're wasting time. So think about the way you're doing your things on your farm. And can you be less wasteful and more efficient? Perhaps you need to upskill. Perhaps when you look at this plan, you say, but I'm not very good at this, or I'm deficient in this knowledge on this component of my business. Think about how you can upskill, upgrade your capacity, your knowledge, your skills, your workmanship, and that of your workers. You know, I think we don't, maybe I'm speaking a bit too generally here, but we don't spend enough effort in raising the capacity of our workers to do the work that we want them to do, to envision them, to give them the ownership and skill to do the work that they need to do. So maybe we need to upskill. What about looking at the working with nature more than against nature? Farming is all about working with nature. Thinking about the biological system that we are in and doing things in such a way that biology, nature works for us rather than us working against nature. There are many ways that we can improve our integration in the ecology of our farm so that it works in a really coordinated and biological and healthy way. And if we do that, we will find that our costs will decrease and our yield will improve. And then finally, I think we can think about our communications. Communicating with our workers, communicating with our market, communicating with our suppliers, communicating with our animals and with our plants and with our fields. You know, going out and getting in touch with those things on our farm, the land, the soil, the plants, the animals, and getting in touch more closely and more intimately with the people who are on our farm, communicating our desires, our hopes, our goals, our visions, the why of what we are doing on our farm. You know, if people know the why, they are more willing to do the how, they're more willing to do the what. So as a farm owner, farm manager, farm operator, express your goals and your vision and your plan and your strategies to everyone and everything on your farm so that you're working together to be a successful farmer. So I trust that this little lesson has been useful to you. We will continue in another episode to look at more aspects of farming for profit. So thank you for watching and happy farming.